Welcome to the WaterTalk. It's my honor to introduce Greg Baird to you. Who's going to give a talk on the financing of water infrastructure. It's also part of a class in the course Water Resource Economics. Greg is the president of the Water Finance Research Foundation, Financial Management Infrastructure Asset Management Specialist from the US. In full support today here of the Canadian military. You pointed out to us earlier today. And a lot of the work that Greg is doing already for a long time is focused on helping governments and utilities to improve the cost effectiveness of their operations and assessing the affordability of their water services. Greg has served on as a financial officer in California for a full-service city with a population of 200,000 people, Modesto, and he was the CFO of Colorado's third largest municipal utility, serving over 300,000 people. He has also worked for some top water management engineering firms, including Stantec and GHD, in financial asset management and affordability engagements. He serves actively as chair of the Sustainable Infrastructure Committee with the American Water Works Association and is a member of the Rates and Charges and Asset Management Committees. He's also on the American Public Works Association Engineering and Technology Committee, and he's the chair of the Underground Infrastructure Technology Subcommittee. With the American Society of Civil Engineers, he is on the Utility Asset Management Committee in order to help answer the question of what to do with poor and aging infrastructure. And then in terms of training, he's an asset management trainer and contributor to Louisiana's Tech's Certificate of Training in Asset Management series. And at Virginia Tech, he's the Sustainable Water Infrastructure Management Education Chair for their new online water asset management certificate training series, and is also supporting the development of a US national pipe inventory database called Pipe ID. Finally, he's been promoting the 2018 release of Utah State University's water main break rates in the USA and Canada, a comprehensive study to increase awareness of aging water infrastructure and the need for especially life cycle cost analysis and how artificial intelligence and machine learning can be used in underground water pipe assessments. Greg is widely published on municipal utility infrastructure, asset management, and integrated finance issues for the US and Canadian water industry. Please join me in welcoming Greg to the stage.
Well, thank you very much. I was very happy to be invited to Waterloo, and you guys brought the great weather for us also to actually talk about water. The topic, Perspectives on Sustainable Water Infrastructure Challenge, Engineering, Technology, or Financial Crisis. I thought the topic was kind of interesting because a lot of times people try to define the water issues very narrowly. And it really doesn't matter what nature of school, academia, organization, or any place where you come from. A lot of times information is trapped in a silo. People are trapped in a particular discipline. And that by itself actually shuts down innovation. And it doesn't necessarily get to the different places where we can actually elevate ourselves and from more holistic advantages be able to tackle some of the different challenges that we have dealing with water, and more specifically water as a sustainable infrastructure. So, so that's kind of the basis of engineering, technology, or financial crisis. You know, let's talk about some of these different issues. I wanted to, first of all, you know, thank you for kind of spending some time on that bio. I kind of have a little bit unique perspective. You know, some people, if you talk to an engineer, they're going to say the water crisis, infrastructure crisis, it's an engineering issue. If you talk to a field personnel at a utility, he's going to say it's an O&M issue. If you talk to each of them and say, well, are we missing the technology? Do we not know what to do? They'll say, no, there's a lot we can do out there, but we don't have the money. So at some point, it actually, all roads kind of lead to finance. And that's where it's kind of an interesting story for myself. When I was the chief financial officer for Aurora Water, they just came out of a serious drought in Colorado for several years. And they hired me as the CFO, and I had $1 billion of old assets. I'm adding $800 million of new assets. We've had serious rate increases to build major projects for drought hardening, so we couldn't increase the rates anymore, and the financial markets just went haywire. So you couldn't go out and borrow any money. So I'm sitting there with a situation going, how am I going to best allocate the limited funding that we have? And I had to start reaching out and looking at infrastructure asset management practices from New Zealand, the UK, Australia, Canada with CNAM, and try to really see all the different elements that's happening to then bring back to my population 300,000. And as the finance guy, basically start an asset management program. Why? Because of these limited issues, and we wanted to be able to best allocate it. And I was actually in a position to kind of know everything what was happening on the capital plan, everything that was happening on the water resource planning, everything that was happening in the maintenance side, and everything happening in the operations side. So it actually gave me that advantage to be able to look at that. So with that experience, I've tried to do a lot of different things. Working water engineering with some of the different AE firms, but the angle that I have in the US market is from the American Water Works Association, Sustainable Infrastructure and Asset Management. From the American Public Works Association, because 85% of all municipal utilities in the US are owned or controlled by a municipal government. So it's the mayor, it's a city council, it's some form of government like that that's actually making the policies and holding the funding streams essentially to take care of those different water issues. And so a lot of that falls over into the American Public Works Association under utility departments. Also, we have a lot of different movement with the American Society of Civil Engineers. Like Canada, the US has their report card with all the major infrastructure systems and water and wastewater being two of those. Nonetheless, getting Ds, and I don't think anybody here is getting a D, right? No, you know, everybody's B plus or higher. But nonetheless, if you are getting a poor grade, wouldn't there be a remedy to try to say, what can we do to be able to turn that around? I'm also on the ISO Committee 251 technical committee. If in infrastructure asset management, there's ISO 55000, well, our technical committee is trying to look at 55010, which is the financial integration of infrastructure asset management practices. So even on the world stage, everybody realizes that that financial integration and concern is a very important component. And with everything, to take and change institutions, maybe not a creative destruction of the water institutions that are supposed to support our 24/7 clean drinking water, but we're trying to create the educational process to try to help people understand how we can break down these different disciplines and be able to integrate the approach and process. And some of that kind of ties to some of the asset management training that's actually out there. It's not just for engineers, you know, but it's water personnel, finance personnel, elected officials. So with that, I wanted to start out and talk about the market in the US. Here we have 21 utilities basically serving populations greater than 1 million. Then we have 408 utilities serving population 100,000 to 1 million. So that's a lot of population just in the first, 500 utilities or so. And what we need to realize that in any time we get surveys, we get information, a lot of times it's actually the top of the pyramid is what we're actually hearing, what needs to be done, what the funding issue is, what they want the federal government to do, because it's the top tiers that have the large engineering departments. They have the resources. Their rates are spread against a very large base. So they have, they're probably talking about affordability issues also because they have a lot of infrastructure to take care of, but they actually have some resources. When you dip down into the 563 utilities, 50,000 to 100,000, and then you start going into these other segments, you can see fairly quickly that maybe the group that no one hears from are the over 40,000 water utilities serving less than population 5,000. This is where someone could be the mayor, the utility director, and they're out there closing the valve, for turning on, the water on and off for different irrigation systems. You have, if they had an operator that actually had certification, then that person is also wearing many hats as the inspector, as, all these different things are occurring. But at the same time, they all have treatment requirements. They all have some level of treatment plant, and they all have water distribution systems and collection systems. It's just how well do you think they're actually being maintained at these lower levels, when they probably don't have the funding, they don't have the basis, and they might not have the capacity to take care of those. Now, there's a problem with the perception of water. When you see this picture initially, what do you think? You think it's kind of cool, and then all of a sudden your scientific, university brain starts going and saying, okay, how did they do that? What's the hydraulics, and where's the pipe? And you start kind of thinking through that, and then you're like, okay, I'm a smart guy, I figured it out. But the perception of water is essentially that how many of you, when you woke up this morning and you took a 12-minute hot shower, how many of you were thinking about where the source water of that water came from, how it actually was conveyed through transmission pipes, how it was actually treated, then it came to your dorm, hotel, house, you heated it up, you used it, and then as it went down the system, where is it going into the collection system, and is it recharging the aquifer, is it going out to the ocean, what's going on with that? So when I say that there's a problem with the perception, when you talk about most of the people in the United States or Canada are typical citizens in North America, we never think of where the water's coming from or the infrastructure that supports it, and we never think of where it's going and what any environmental impacts are on either sides of that equation. And when there's a lot of discussions on we can't get people to understand that they need to fund these things, there's a kind of resistance there, because a lot of times we haven't educated everybody about the infrastructure that's supporting both sides of where the water's coming from and where the water's actually going. And it's that lack of knowledge, because a lot of people will tell me, Greg, water's free. It fell from the sky. It should be free. And when I've increased water rates in different parts of the country, I'm like going, that's great. You take your free bucket, you drive down to the treatment plant, we'll show you where a free spigot is, and you can fill your bucket up to your heart's content and take it back to your house and stuff, and I won't charge you for it. I actually had someone, who took me up on that. And about a week and a half, he and his son basically said, guess what, fine, I'll pay our water bill, turn back on our water, because all of a sudden, conveying that much water through the system and back to their house and everything, it was inconvenient, and evidently maybe the water's free, but all the infrastructure and the cost to build it and maintain it is not free. So we luckily cleared that issue up. So with those perceptions, though, out there in the general populace, we also have the nature of water utilities and wastewater utilities. They've gone from this quiet agency that maybe was a blip on your utility bill to something very significant, both environmentally as well as on a cost-effective affordability issue also. So it's a hot topic. So even at the utility side, we can see that there's actually a lot of lack of planning. Now, out of the, I think it was 700 utilities that responded to this, you can see the numbers maybe in the 30s and 50% as far as how many people are actually doing asset management plans, groundwater asset plans, drought management, conservation, financial plans, really understanding the makeup of our water systems and information by actually doing this planning. But remember I showed you this? This is the top of the pyramid, the people with the resources actually to do that. So the whole bottom of the pyramid, you're not even getting, double digits. And that becomes a big issue when you look at the number of utilities and the size of the problem that we have. Utilities can be resistant. Cost-effective innovation is delayed. People in the water industry, does everybody know that Rip Van Winkle story? Guy that falls asleep for 20 years and he kind of wakes up and it's like 20 years later. Well, in the water industry, the story is that, a guy falls asleep, he wakes up 20 years, next thing you know, he's like, wow, cell phones, computer, quantum processing, AI, machine learning, oh, this is like amazing. I can't believe everything that's changed. He goes over to the water industry and it's exactly the same. No innovation, nothing happened, nothing changed. So we can actually see where the philosophy of age-based pipe replacement, kind of doing that. Yeah, next thing you know, you're trying to replace pipes and 30–40% of those pipes are just fine because you didn't do the condition assessment. You just thought, hey, after 50 years, after 70 years, I'm going to go in and dig it up without some other level analysis. So you do some condition assessment, you do some other things, you spend some different money. But it's really interesting when you see the new technologies that are actually coming into play. Now you have, satellite doing imagery to be able to identify, for leak detection. You have AI machine learning, pulling in your pipe break data and pulling in 1,200 other variables from soil and corrosion and pH and salt intrusion and traffic loading and all these other different variables and pulling that in and doing machine learning AI to basically say, hey, over the next 12 months or the next 5 years, here's where we believe your hot spots are going to be in your system based on those statistical probability. Really nice walking by the Waterloo AI section. I thought that was really cool. But once again, I just came from Atlanta, so AWWA had a water infrastructure conference, and in talking to some of the people there, some of the frustration with a lot of the condition assessment firms are that the utilities, it's still hard to be able to get them to adopt innovation. They're still resistant, they're still hesitant, they're still like, oh, I don't have the money for it. But it's like, okay, so what you're telling me is, you're going to replace a mile of pipe for $1.2 million, and you're going to wait until there's a sinkhole or until it destroys some roads and shuts down some businesses and stuff, which is going to cost you 2 to 4 times more doing it on a failure mode versus actually spending some money to figure out how to avoid that failure and thus disruption and actually save your utility and your customer some money. And once again, it's educating them against that resistance. Also, sustainability analysis is not well understood. ISO, Lifecycle Assessment, LCAs, I threw that in there. I'm in Canada, so there's the title. You can actually look this up and go to the website. It's in English, French, and Spanish, actually. But I threw this one in because everybody the carbon units and the carbon footprint, looking at things. So if you look at carbon units of monetizing your underground pipe infrastructure and compare different pipes, then all of a sudden it paints a different picture when you kind of look at it from a sustainability standpoint. But once again, and I can say that as the chair of the Sustainable Infrastructure Committee, there's still resistance or a lack of understanding in the marketplace to be able to take hard direct costs and then look at the indirect costs associated with the environmental effects associated with maybe the total life cycle cost, the total cost of ownership, and looking at some of those triple bottom line impacts that sustainability really wants us to consider. We know that, all of these different issues are happening across Canada, across the US, but each utility is a little different. And that's kind of the challenge because you kind of have to say, here's the general guidelines, but then next you have to be able to apply it to an individual utility need with different pipe materials, different ages, different practices. But we hear and we keep hearing all of these different results and studies about, cast iron pipes and asbestos cement pipes, two pipes that aren't, manufactured or installed anymore, creating a lot of the angst that's out there. Cast iron brakes in a study, 46% increase in 6 years. Asbestos cement, 43% increase over the 6 years. And we start seeing that the age of our infrastructure is still continuing to age or get worse. And everywhere has this historic underinvestment. And here in Canada, it's the same type of thing when it's basically saying 29, 35, 23% of potable water systems are in a condition where it actually needs a lot more investment to be able to take care of it. With a lot of utilities basically saying, yeah, we're spending our money on emergency repairs, not preventative work. The emergency repairs, if we remember, it's 2 to 4 times more costly. So when we start looking at where are these different hot spots and what infrastructure are we talking about, it's almost every infrastructure, but nonetheless, let's focus on water. And we can see these different things. There's a lot of different drivers that's occurring in these different areas. But when we actually break it down, and this is a 20 cities profile on starting in 1870s to 1996 of the miles and cost of pipe that they actually put into the ground collectively for these 20 cities. And if I threw their population data collectively up there also, obviously you could see where their population boom was occurring. And we could see, okay, post-World War II, the urbanization and things leaving the farms and coming out there, and in the high 70s and stuff like that, people flocking to the cities for jobs. Then the infrastructure had to get built for that demographic shift, that population growth. But now, when we start looking at saying at some point we're going to need to start repairing and replacing all of this pipe, then it gives us essentially this green graph. And so you can see where there's the built environment, and now all of a sudden the costs are coming home. Someone built it, someone's been managing it, paying for it, but now someone's going to need to replace it, so we're in the replacement era. And when we look closely, we're kind of like right there at the beginning. And I can, it doesn't matter what city or municipality, the curve is a little shaped different, okay? But nonetheless, there's this big tsunami of infrastructure that needs to occur. And a Band-Aid approach isn't going to work. It needs to be, theoretical. It needs to be strategic. It needs to be able to be implemented. And when you tie all those costs together from a finance perspective and you take a hard look, it's kind of scary because it's something that you hadn't seen before. And when you're trying to, play it out and say what's going to happen going into the future, it gets really scary because you're talking about drinking water for people, and we know that water is life. And it forces you to start looking at, risk. I need to identify the risk. I need to see what level of risk I'm going to take on. I need to be able to figure out where I'm spending the money to be able to buy down that risk. Or is there some way I can transfer the risk, i.e., unfunded mandate from government back to local cities. So there's all these issues that you have to take into consideration. And the challenge is, yes, we know that we have a poor report score on our report card. Funding for capital improvement projects, that's always at the top of everybody's list on how are we going to fund it. And it leads to the next question with, how we're going to recover, through rates and charges, and how are we going to take care of all of these other different issues. At the same time, we saw that kind of demographic piece. Well, at the same time, our workforce is retiring. So Joe, who's been with the utility for 35 years, and he knows where every valve is buried, behind so-and-so's big bush, behind their oak. The city keeps paving over this one valve here, and maybe it's written down on a map. Most of the time it's in his head, so next time there's a water main break, you're going to have to spend 70% more time shutting off more valves to be able to shut off that that single pipe. So you're wasting more water, and now you're actually impacting more customers and more houses around that water main break because of that loss of information and that coordination of pipes, valves, leaks, and it's not necessarily captured. Now we have the technology, GIS and other things to be able to really visualize that and see that, and that's a huge benefit. And it's kind of become a standard, so we can actually start knowing what's going on. And with that knowledge and location, we can start actually correlating some of the other findings that are out there, such as corrosion. So we kind of knew it intuitively, and when we look at the Utah State study from 2018, they got these, looking at 300 utilities, that then each of those utilities, they did some analysis of the corrosive soils in each of those utility, and then they compared that back to the main breaks by pipe material. So next thing you know, cast iron pipe is 20 times more break rates in highly corrosive soils, and ductile iron is 10 times more, has more break rates. And 45% of these utilities are using some sort of condition assessment. And then a big thing, smaller utilities have 2 times more breaks than large utilities. Huge policy issues as it relates to federal, state, and at the local level. Once again, we think of that pyramid, and we think of the lack of capacity and affordability and stuff to be able to do that. And now we can see and demonstrate that they're actually, once again, being impacted at a worse situation. Now this is interesting. This is main breaks by pipe material: asbestos, cement, cast iron, steel, duct iron, PVC. Oh, they're still. So U.S. and Canada, and here, except for cast iron, because it's a little corrosive and gets cold and stuff, so that's not very good. But PVC, I mean, you guys, you know, in Calgary and other places, you actually have better insulation practices. You bury it deeper to avoid third-party damage and below the frost line. And you make sure that an inspector is always out there, because then it's actually being installed correctly. And those practices actually give Canada, you know, a better overall score than the U.S. with a lot of main breaks that are out there. So congratulations. But there's a need to still know the total cost of ownership. And this is where finance has to kind of step in and just say, okay, engineers, you need to understand that it's just not that initial cost. That the acquisition has a lot of other things to it. And in engineering math, and when you look at life cycle costing, there has to be that consideration to say, here's choice 1, here's choice 2. Now let's go ahead, not just look at what most procurement practices want to say is your initial cost, and let's choose the low bid, but let's actually take sustainability concerns into play. Let's look at that asset that you're purchasing over you know, a greater lifespan, and because a lot of times it's not the initial cost, it's the O&M, it's the maintenance, it's the energy that goes into it, especially for, you know, long-term assets. And so being able to do life cycle costing as part of a policy for sustainable infrastructure and water, then it gives you the ability to actually make a better long-term decision because you actually want to try to drive costs down in your decision making while you're increasing, you know, the stability and sustainability of your water systems. But the only way you can do that is actually through comparable analysis. So comparable analysis really is a determination of how mature is your asset management program. What capacity do you have? A lot of systems, they're still really caught in a reactive cycle. You know, we're spending 50% of our time and energy taking care of emergency repairs, which means we're not getting ahead of the equation, which means we're not actually effectively using our money. When someone will say, hey, Greg, come in here and, you know, analyze our asset management program, or I get a CFO that says, guess what? The capital plan is off the roof. The O&M, I can't believe it. We hired an asset management team, consultants and stuff, and their numbers are just off the chart. I can't accept this. So I go in there and they go, oh, here's all of the financial information, figure out what's going wrong. And I'm like going, no. I need to go look at your computerized maintenance management work order system, because what I'm going to figure out is they're spending all their money on reactive, and they haven't maybe finance hasn't invested in it and it hasn't turned the tide and stuff. So all of a sudden on an equation where if you're going 80% reactive, 20% preventative, and then based on that model, you're projecting for the next 10 years with a 2.5% inflationary piece, and that's your projected budget, yeah, I'd get upset too. Because you actually need to get it down to a 60-40 or a 40-60 or back down to 20% emergency work, 80% preventative, and now that's going to be more reasonable when you project it into the future. But I had to actually go back at their maintenance records, work order pieces, and analyze what they're doing or not doing in asset management to try to address the financial issue that the CFO had. But also, I believe everybody's on some level of maturity with their system. So, lifecycle asset management, another way to be able to look at it. This is really talking about design, construction, operations and maintenance, and all the different pieces, repair, replacement, and stuff, and gathering up those costs for each of those different elements. And people don't realize that at the design level, if you design something poorly, you've probably locked in over 60%, 70% of what your long-term O&M costs are going to be just based on the design. So if your O&M guys aren't going back to the design guys and say, you're going to have to design it differently because it's too hard to fix and that breaks too often, and you've increased the price of that asset. So when you think of putting these different concepts and goals together, the goal is to extend the life of the asset. Makes sense? 30 to 70% of equipment maintenance activities typically misdirected, and it's not cost-effective deferring failure. So you get, something, you put it in, you install it, you look at the warranty, and it says oil it once a month. By the time you look at a lot of your equipment in the installed environment, the effort that you're actually doing might not be doing anything to extend the life of that asset. And you kind of need to gather that data in and figure it out to kind of optimize your operation. You need to kind of know your current condition, know your risk, because it lets you know you can only maintain what the remaining service level is. So if it's past a certain condition level now, you kind of have to figure out what's it going to take. Can I extend it, or I'm just trying to stretch it out for as long as I can. But every time you touch an asset, update the condition. Figure out what that remaining useful life is. Then you can actually figure out your cost of repair and replacement. Now this gets a little busy, but at the same time, it kind of lets you know that it's the trick of pulling the data together to know when and where you need to intervene. So, if you buy a car and you bought a used car, because when you get your big famous job, in R&D internationally, and then you're going to own your brand new car, right? So you're a student and you bought a used car. Well, if you knew kind of exactly what that condition was, now you're going to be able to think, okay, I need to stretch it out, over, I don't know, you go do your PhD program, so stretch it out over, what, 8 years or 6 years? And you need it to last. So it kind of says, I'm not going to just put oil in it, every, 3,000 to 7,000 miles, depending on the type of oil and the type of car, but I'm going to need to do some other things to be able to manage it. And it's the same type of thing, with our different assets, knowing that condition, knowing when to intervene so it's not going to be a higher cost. If you replace an asset too early, you wasted money. And if you replace an asset too late, you spent too much money. And if it's a critical asset, then it could be a higher cost of catastrophic failure. But when you look at total life cycle costs and capital planning, once again, your cost at the beginning to create it is actually lower than the operations and maintenance, but then it's where you jump in at different points in time. And when you can look at two different materials, pipe materials, or two different processes, or two different rehab technologies or insulation processes, and you can make those comparisons, then you can kind of say, okay, I'm choosing one over the other but I kind of need to go back and fix my procurement process because low bid wasn't going to give me a sustainable product. And this is where I say, what's the capital cost, 65 to 85% are locked in just at the design phase, which is huge. Lifecycle O&M costs are normally much higher than the initial costs. And if we look at this example here, we can see that the initial cost is that small sliver. Maintenance costs are pretty good, but it's energy costs. And if we knew our energy costs were that high, then essentially our analysis would be, okay, let's do a couple. We're going to need to be replacing some pumps at some point. So let's go ahead and do some life cycle cost analysis to be able to figure out which pump we're going to do, which is going to be more energy efficient. When we look at the condition and the probability of failure in dealing with asset management, most places are using a likelihood of failure score 1 to 5. So that's the probability of when it's going to fail, how soon. And then the consequence of failure is what's that impact going to be, which could be on the sewer side. That impact of failure could be, your basement just filled up with sewage, or something worse. That's pretty bad. And you do this scale and you say, okay, based on this criticality scoring, I'm going to need to focus on the assets that are in this red area. Because if I'm going to spend any time, if I'm going to spend any money, I want to spend it in the place that it's going to count. I need to know I'm going to spend some money and it's going to buy down the risk. And look at that. Now, on the financial side, the Canadian Water Network has done a lot of work on financial stability. Because affordability, obviously is a big issue. When we look at some of the different results, has anybody seen this? Okay. Anybody work on this? Oh, yeah, you did. Well, that's why I included it, because you said you were going to be here. So the full cost recovery component, revenues and costs, interest, other charges, federal grants, development, storm, wastewater, water and wastewater rates, you would assume that your costs and your revenues are matched and balanced. The issue, though, comes into full cost recovery, which is a lot of places, they're not actually calculating what the full burden of your water system is. They have done incremental increases because politically they could only increase your rates 3%. And when so-and-so was the mayor who said no more rate increases in water and sewer, then for those 8 years they didn't increase anything. And now the fact that there's that aging infrastructure which says your O&M costs are increasing, and now you kind of have to play catch up, really says that single incremental annual single digits don't cut it anymore. You're now going to need to really figure out what that full cost is. But politically, if you were just in the election cycle elected for 4 years and you just spent 2 years getting there and you're 2 years into that, and next thing you know, someone's coming to you and say, hey, we need to do full cost recovery, and you go, well, what does that mean? And you hear double-digit increases for multiple years, and you're thinking, wow, 2 years of that, I'm not going to get elected. And all of a sudden, out of 4 to 6, 7 people, and half of them are on that type of election cycle, you can start counting the votes, and there's not going to be a whole lot of support to be able to do that. The governance models that we have really affect the fact that, whether or not we can actually get to full cost or not, whether or not they can recognize that. Now, I've been around the block a few times with city councils and different places. I've had to increase development fees by 500%. Sounds like a big number, but no one did it for 17 years. I've had to do 1 year increases of 83%. My wife didn't appreciate the death threats on that one, but at the same time, it's just, the alternative was you weren't going to basically start having good quality water. Someone needed to calculate it, someone needed to send the message, and a lot of times you just need to be able to say, this is what your water cost you. And most of the time it's the difference of one less Starbucks coffee a month, and you're going to have 24/7 good clean drinking water. But when they increase your coffee by 25%, did anybody riot? Come on, you're university students. Fine, you're not from Berkeley, but you probably said, hey, this cut into my budget. And you probably said, okay, there's one less cup of coffee a month than I can afford. But on the municipal side, all of a sudden it's like, hey, we need to increase rates by 10%, and it's $1.67. Whoa, everybody's crazy, everybody upset, let's throw the mayor out, let's do this, and it creates, a huge riot and stuff. And then in City Hall, seriously, all it takes is like 10 citizens to call, and it's like, the streets are on fire. So the bottom line is everybody really needs to say and have a backbone and basically do the work and analysis and basically go up and say, here's what your water costs. And so think of that first picture that I showed you, where all of a sudden it's like, here's the infrastructure, where's it going? So basically you say, guess what? There's a lot of infrastructure. You're enjoying your shower, you're enjoying turning on your tap and drinking water. You don't have to boil it. That's the service level, that's what you expect. And guess what? This is what it's going to cost to be able to support it. And I think in the industry, I think we're doing baby steps, and we're dancing around, and we're walking on eggshells, and we basically need to say no, throw down and say, this is our infrastructure, this is our water. Water is life. This is what it costs. We're enjoying this quality of water. The other side of it is, if you don't fund it at appropriate level, the alternative is your level of service goes down. Case in point, China. They boil all of their water. Okay? Is it by choice? It's the level of service that they have. When I was a few years back and I had a lot of the Russian satellite water organizations, and they came to Colorado and I was presenting, and I kept talking about 24/7 clean drinking water, and finally some hands went up, and through interpreters and stuff, they were saying, what do you mean by that? I'm like going, well, you have to assess the criticality of the condition, figure out how much money it pays, break it into the rates, and then that's how you maintain your service level. And they're like going, okay, well, our citizens understand that on Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and Sunday, they can get their clean drinking water. That's good. They get hot water, half the week also. And the other times the system's down. And I said, okay, so based on the level of funding, based on your infrastructure, that is the level of service that you're providing. In the US, we have different standards. In Canada, we have different standards. So it's kind of a different point, but you don't want it to deteriorate to a point where you can't get around it. So when I'll analyze a water system and the rates and stuff, I'm like, oh, okay, so you need 10% a year, 3 years in a row, to take care of this stuff, or your service level is going to drop. And they're like, well, what does that mean? I don't know, 2 boil notices a year with some sinkholes and City Hall's in a low area, so maybe it will flood out. They're like, you can't say that. I'm like, I don't have to, because look at the state of your infrastructure, and if you don't fix it, there's going to be a natural result. That's your level of service. So when you think of the breakdown of the different streams of revenue, you have different charges, different places to do it, but your biggest component is really the monthly or quarterly water rate charges that you calculate and you build in and send on the customer bill. And there's different ways to be able to formulate that rate structure with different, depending on your objectives at whether or not you're going to incentivize, conservation. But when you think about it from a utility standpoint, you have staff. They're not variable. You have treatment plants, you have pipes and stuff. So most of the infrastructure that's actually there to be able to support our 24/7 clean drinking water, source to tap type of thing, it's a fixed cost. but most of our rate structures are kind of set at a variable cost, therefore revenue stability becomes an issue. Now, shifting to infrastructure asset management, here we have the IIMM, kind of the Bible of infrastructure asset management. It's a multidisciplinary approach because planning and finance and engineering and all these different elements really need to come together. You need to break down the silos to be able to support those things. Now, you probably didn't have a quiz, but here we go. 1, Hollywood action movie. 2, new car wash method. When I showed this to my son, he said, "Oh, Dad, the guy dropped his car keys." Like, oh, didn't see that one. C, aging infrastructure. D, a CFO's nightmare. Okay, so 62-inch water main break in LA, and it was condition assessment. So this is a normal street. They had a water main break. You know, it happened at the night, so they call out the fire truck, and that's what happened to the fire truck, right? Kind of serious deal. So LA freaks out, okay? And they're like going, okay, this is bad. This is getting all over the news and stuff. This is really a bad PR thing for everybody. So what do? They get $1 billion, $900 million, you know, bond money, and they say, throw it at the problem, fix this, because we don't want this to happen again. Okay. Well, when you have like $30 billion of infrastructure, and you know, it was like a Band-Aid approach. So, you know, and when you look at a lot of the different main breaks and different stories that are out there, they knew that these streets were bad. They knew that the condition of these pipes were poor, and it was past its service life, and it needs to be addressed. So when you start looking at and fixing it from this standpoint versus preventative, you can see why it's going to cost 2 to 4 times more. You know, multiply that in a lot of different places. So part of infrastructure asset management is doing the condition assessment component. Know what that condition is. It was still a CFO's nightmare too. And there's a lot of principles for sustainable water infrastructure. I'm not going to go into all of this, and I've hit on some of these. But there's some basic principles to be able to set some policies. Because someone might say, okay, infrastructure asset management, but then they want to get to sustainability. And a lot of times, a lot of cities, they'll call me up and they'll say, okay, Greg, you know, we're starting a sustainability program. We've hired a sustainability manager. What do we do first? And I'm like, well, you go and you figure out your assets, and you figure out the condition of your assets, and you probably hire an asset manager. Because how in the world are you going to actually assess how sustainable you are if you don't know what your unfunded infrastructure issue is? And it's interesting when a lot of people get really uptight and they're like, oh, the pension liability. There's this huge unfunded pension liability, and we're going to downgrade your credit because of it. You can look at a lot of those different cities and institutions, and you can go, you know, your infrastructure issue is actually 3 times more than your pension liability. It's still all unfunded, and you need to figure that out too, because your aging workforce and your aging infrastructure was all kind of occurring at the same time. So allocation of private partnerships. It's interesting, when I was in city management in California, and different private water companies wanted to come and buy parts of my system type of thing, and I'm like, you know, and my philosophy was, okay, you're going to increase everybody's rates even more because you guys are going to make a profit, okay? Now I've been around a few times, and I've seen so many different water systems that it's like, okay, given your governance model, given your lack of capacity and motivation to take care of your system, yeah, you should privatize, because you know, you're actually going to transfer that risk. They'll at least take care of the problem. It can be contractual, and now long-term rates are actually going to be lower than what they were going to be if you guys just sat there and did nothing, let alone the other types of issues. You know, i.e. Flint, Michigan, i.e. a lot of other different issues and places. So there is a role for private business to be able to come in, and a lot of times it's not that, oh, now they're going to be able to make a profit. They're limited at what they can make, but it's really, we haven't quantified the risk that we're carrying, and we're transferring it in a marketplace, and now they get to carry that risk. Therefore, they get to actually, you know, have a return on that investment on that risk that they're owning. And that's usually one of the biggest issues with figuring out when and where and how private partnerships can really come into play. So there's a shifting focus kind of from the short-term viewpoint for initial cost to long-term management for our assets. We talked about the initial acquisition. I'm going to hopefully have another slide on that to talk about the law of fives. We've talked about life cycle cost and the analysis with math that we need to include in here. Our decision making now, we have more data. We can do better planning. You would expect that then there's more accountability or transparency with that to be able to start vetting the numbers that we have, to be able to do better forecasts and match that timing and understand what that risk is. And but it's this balancing effect. It's kind of like what you can get done over the weekend, go out with your friends or finish that paper. So there's balancing the sustainable issues, economic, social, environmental. There's balancing, cash on hand. That balance raises affordability issues. You have various options. In financing, we've heard a lot more about green bonds, 100-year century bonds. Investors who probably are not going to make as much money, but they want to feel better about the world and the environment. Therefore, they're going to be funding these different activities. And so if you can formulate a project that kind of sounds or looks a little bit more green, then it can be eligible for some of these other different institutional funding mechanisms. Governance and ownership is always an issue. Municipalization, consolidation, privatization, all needs to be analyzed. Some things need to go back to the city. Other things should go to the private side. The fact that we let development just sprawl and create all these little water systems and all these different pockets to the point where your province or your state can't really regulatorily take care of all of these different things kind of says you now need to consolidate and put them together. And are you putting that back over onto the municipality, or are you going to bring in some private company and contractually be able to run it? Intergenerational AL, and then equity. So a lot of these are long-term assets. And that's where a lot of times people want to say, okay, it's a 100-year asset. I understand it needs to be replaced, but why does it need to come out of my pocket all at once today? And that's where century bonds and green bonds and other things, not just on a 20-year funding process or the typical bond market for 30 years, but can you get some financing over 50 years or 100 years, because now multi-generations can basically pay for the replacement of that asset, and those costs can be spread over time. So that's a hot topic, and that ties into the affordability equation also. U.S. Conference of Mayors recently released this a few months ago, competitive procurement practices. They basically said the average cost to replace drinking water pipes in open competitions, 26% per mile less. And so we see some of these different things. So a lot of places, they're locked down and say, nope, we're only using one kind of pipe. We're only using one type of vendor. We're only doing one type of thing, and it really shuts down innovation. And it really, because I knew as a finance person, I needed to have a competitive bid. I needed to open my procurement practices and my policies necessary to be able to allow new innovation, new tools, which kind of meant I need to kind of step it up. But once again, utilities and cities, it's, they're kind of resistant to change, or a lot are, and it's part of the equation of driving up the costs. Optimizing, I think that it's been overused, but a lot of times optimizing really is dealing with the investment decision process on the O&M side and on the capital side. This is part of a 10-step process for asset management. But when you look at optimized decision making, it can break down into the fact that we're really trying to make decisions to get to the lowest cost of renewal. Not the initial cost, but the lowest overall total cost of ownership cost. And there's different ways to be able to do that. And there's different levels of analysis. And remember when I talked about the maturity of a water utility? Well, depending on the maturity and the tools that they have, finding it's all available, but then they're only going to probably select what they have the capacity to do it, but at least they're maybe moving the dial and moving forward. But there's really a need to have utilities act more like businesses and to govern them themselves with the accountability for the long-term effect with sustainability and demonstrate that and be able to not be afraid, this is what your water costs. We can reduce your service level and everybody can boil their water, or this is what it costs. I think there's going to be some easy choices if you get the information. The fundamental questions are really, where am I spending the money? What am I trying to build? When and where do I need to repair and replace? And 80% of the funding out of utilities and time and everything is really chasing after these three questions. Now, a challenge to you as you do your studies and the thesis and figuring out really cool things, it's anything that you can do to move the equation, make this better, faster, stronger, cheaper. That's where the market needs to go. And they're hungry for it. They're low resistant. They're a little hungry. It's not a bad thing, but at the same time, that's what you need to do. Wanted to talk about the law of fives, because a lot of times people are talking to the engineers, they're talking to the O&M people and stuff, but by the time you talk to the finance people, now, guess what? If you don't do your maintenance, it's going to cost you 5 times more to start doing your repairs. If you're not doing your repairs, and your rehab, and you're going to have to, it's going to be 5 times more. And then if you get to replacement, it's going to be 5 times even more than that. So if you know what the condition of your asset is, and you do that preventative maintenance, and you try to extend that asset life, now you're actually making money, or you're preventing, costing too much going forward. That type of note, that type of equation, the finance guy is going to go, oh, okay, I get that. What you're telling me is I'm not funding you at the right level, so all of a sudden we're going to go from a condition 2 to 4 really quickly with 5 right there. In California, with the Great Depression and everything that was occurring and stuff in 2006, 2007 with my colleagues, we basically said, okay, this is what's going to happen. We're going to go into budget freezes. We're going to end up cutting our O&M guys. The maintenance isn't going to occur. And things are going to get worse from there. So in 2012, 13, 14, they're calling me up. They're going, Greg, my CIP's spiking. Everything's failing. What's going on? I'm like, okay. In 2006, we talked about that. You didn't maintain it, and now you can't throw enough money at it to be able to fix it. You're going to have to replace it. Your 20-year asset was failing at year 17. Your 40-year asset was failing at year 27. And you progress so far down, you're going to have to replace it. You can't repair it to get it back to that state. So every asset, there's a theoretical best investment. It's figuring that out. Every asset is going to deteriorate at some form or fashion. You need to be able to track that and understand that. So from a financial perspective, it is all about the money. It is all about the eventual investment. It's all about that type of decision making. It's all about trying to determine what the different options are. Because then when you have 2 choices in the data, then you can make appropriate decisions. But to do that and know you're going to do that, then you're going to want to start tracking the different categories and analyzing and making these different comparisons, because then that's where you're going to see the cost savings, or at least defer having to spend more money and more rates. A lot of the affordability issues that are out there are actually caused because of a lack of proper planning for decades. And at some point it needs to balance out, and at some point then they can say, we're running our system with low life cycle cost. We're not just calling it cost effective, because that can just justify whatever we want to say. So there's a need for life cycle cost analysis. Without measurement of an asset and the operational activities, your utility will never know whether the money they spend is just right, too little, or too much. And as a result, Utilities tend to overspend just to make sure, and when there's no true measurement, there can be no control process, thus no continuous improvement. So with that, I'll stop there, and thank you. I had 100 more slides, but you know, that's all right.
I was just going to say, we'll invite you again next week. Thank you so much, Greg. I'm trying to make this work, but I don't seem to be able to get the green light. It doesn't come up. I'm pressing. So we have time for a few questions, just one or two. Anyone? In the back.
Oh,
Hi, Greg. Frederick from the City Institute at York University. I really appreciated your talk, and I love the angles. There's so many things I'd like to ask, but to be quick, you mentioned a point about governance models affects investment into assets, and I'm wondering, in the public-private spectrum, certain places in Europe I've been studying have been doing these arm's-length organizations, separating governance of the water system from the private utility, but also from the city. So adding a third leg to a relationship. And I'm wondering, is that a model that we're seeing in the United States? And with your expertise there, I don't know anything about the States.
Well, first of all, we have to look at the fundamental differences, say, of the investment community with, say, Europe or anything outside of the United States. The United States has the enviable muni bond market. So all these municipalities, utilities can kind of go to the bond market if they have good credit standing and borrow pretty cheap money, 3 to 5%. And it's subsidized. It's allowed by the federal government. A lot of the European community, they don't have that benefit. They don't have that subsidization. So for the private capital that is going to want 7, 8, up to 30% on a return investment. Now, water and wastewater, it's kind of a safe bet. So the threshold of safety is there and risk is very low. Therefore, you shouldn't be able to demand those higher rates. But nonetheless, now that private capital has a market internationally to come in there. And a lot of times then you have the municipalities, government owned, and then you have the private investors who want to make the money, and a lot of times they need to be able to find some middle ground so it doesn't look like the profiteers versus the public good, and you bring kind of that middleman coming in. But part of that whole market equation that's a little bit different than, say, North America is that they don't have access to that low subsidized muni bonds. Now, in the U.S., one of the things that Trump originally said with his infrastructure funding is, let's eliminate some of these different things, and then we can have an infusion of additional, private capital coming in. But then everybody said, wow, you want to do that? If we're looking at $1 trillion over the next 25 years on just our underground pipe infrastructure, we were only assuming that it was going to be at 3 to 5% interest rate, 30-year terms on that. And if you took that away, then that was going to substantially go up, and it would actually kind of eliminate, and increase the cost even more than the need of private capital. And so there's always that discussion.
One more question. Anna.
It's more in two small questions, but you were talking at the beginning that the water industry stays 20 years the same, and that's the fact. But do you see a solution in between the time gap when we need to adopt new standards and new policies and urgency over new installations? Because most of the time we have to use old standards and follow old procedures, install maintenance till the process is in. And do you see anywhere role of insurance companies, insurance area to ensure new installed infrastructure that we can save some money for the future payments?
And that's a good question, very complicated. And so the interesting thing is when you look at the investment and what's occurring, we know that the aging infrastructure needs to occur, and a lot of people are trying to say, do I keep funding my old plant or do I need to build a new plant? And what the cut over time is based on these different costs. And the other component is a lot of people are saying there's climate change, there's a lot of other risks out there, And maybe if I as a city have too much uncertainty and we don't want to have the burden of a potential collapse with our infrastructure, then there could be a role for private insurance at that, transferring that risk and paying a premium to an insurance company to basically assure that we're going to maintain a certain level of service. So there are discussions out there that's occurring with that. The problem is there's not a whole lot of insurance companies that really want to supply that level of interest because they have a lack of the different risk mitigation models. One of the biggest areas that we do see the integration and look of and participation of the insurance companies really comes down to the stormwater area. And I see more movement in the Canadian market in stormwater with the risk of flooding and issues where you have companies like EPCOR out of Edmonton working directly with the Canadian Water Network, Blue Cities, Infrastructure Canada, and a whole host of insurance agencies to try to figure out how can we mitigate this, how can we transfer the costs, how can we use that as additional information and funding necessary to be able to protect our citizens.
Okay, let's give Greg another round of applause. Thank you very much, Greg. I have a very small token of appreciation. Thank you very much.